today we're going to be talking about genetic contributions to the developmental journey. And this is going to happen in two parts. And I'm really happy to be joined today by my colleague, Alyssa Terry. We are both certified genetic counselors, and we work for NIMAC Regional Genetics Network. So I'm guessing if I asked you all right now who is NIMAC, maybe at most a handful of people may know. And if you do, feel free to give me a thumbs up in the chat. It's always nice to know a few people who may recognize our name, but I know for most of you, you might be thinking, what's NIMAC? So just really briefly, NIMAC stands for the New York Mid-Atlantic Caribbean Regional Genetics Network. So that is a mouthful, so that's why we go with NIMAC. And our organization is supported by a federally funded grant from HRSA's Maternal Child Health Bureau. And our mission is to improve access to genetic services for families across our 10 diverse jurisdictions and 62 million people. And as you can see here from this map, our region encompasses 7 states, including the great state of Virginia, the District of Columbia, as well as 2 U.S. territories, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So what NIMAC does is that in order to accomplish our goals, we have in each of our 10 jurisdictions, local teams of diverse stakeholders, which include families with genetic conditions, advocates, genetics and non-genetics healthcare professionals, including doctors, nurses, specialists, and people in the public healthcare realm, such as maternal child health, Title V, children with special healthcare needs, early intervention professionals like yourself. And our teams collaborate with us to ensure that the families in their region have access to quality care and appropriate genetic services. And here on this slide, you see some of the many groups in Virginia that are involved in our local Virginia team. So many of you have already completed this, and I really appreciate those who have. But if you haven't, please take a moment to either click the link on in the chat, which Seth has dropped, or just use the camera app on your phone or tablet to point at the QR code, and a link will pop up, and we'll just ask you to access this survey. Now, the point of the survey is just to help us to learn a little bit more about you. We've told you a little bit about ourselves, but we really want to help get a better sense of what your knowledge is about genetics and how your experience has been with genetics thus far. So if you could just take a moment to do that. I'm guessing because many of you were on the chat and Corey was kind enough to give you time that you may have already completed it. And if you did, if you could just give me a thumbs up, it'll just give us a visual as to how many people have completed this. I see a few thumbs up popping up already. Great, thank you so much. And again, it's not a long survey, but it just really helps us to better get a sense of your experiences with genetics. Thank you. Yep, chat works as well too, Lily. Thank you so much. And I know we're all probably a bit surveyed out, but it's really helpful for us to just get a sense of what your experience has been and how this particular webinar may positively, hopefully positively, impact you and your understanding. So just to remind you, or a heads up, I should say, you will receive the same survey at the end of today's webinar. So don't be surprised when you see it up again at the end of today's talk, and we ask you to again take a few minutes to just complete it so we can get a sense of any changes that may have occurred during our time together. So Seth, I feel like we've gotten a lot of thumbs up and in the chat and on our pictures. Do you agree, or should we give it another 30 seconds?
I think we're good.
Okay, well, that's awesome. If you guys are good, I am good too. So without further ado, let's get going into this. So as I mentioned, this is a 2-part series. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about genetics and doing a little overview. We're going to really focus on why genetics matters for early intervention professionals such as you all. And we're going to really focus on what are the red flags, what do we mean by red flags, and what are the red flags for referrals to genetics that will appear in the children you serve. In our October webinar with you, we're going to go into a little more depth about what NIMAC is and what we do in Virginia. We're going to really take a deep dive into our Virginia Genetic Navigator program and what they do for families. And finally, we're going to talk about how NIMAC and Virginia's Genetic Navigators can be a resource for EI professionals such as yourselves. So why is genetics important? Well, simply put, it's because some of the health challenges that we deal with and our families that we serve deal with are caused by changes in our genes. So I've done a lot of talking, and I would love to hear from you all using the chat function. Can you give me some example of some health challenges that you think may be caused by changes in our genes? I'm going to look at the chat and see. Yes, you can have impact in our growth. Yes, there are some swallowing problems that have a genetic component. Yes, metabolism. Yes, Kristen, that's that. Oh, sorry, Janine, that's a great one. There's a lot of metabolic disorders that are genetic in nature. Cognitive development does have a genetic component. Yes, there are cardiac conditions that have genetics to them. Hearing and vision. Wow. Yep, developmental milestones. Communicate. You guys are great. I don't know if you even need this talk, but since we're here together, we're gonna stick to it. But yes, you guys are grabbing a lot of these really normal, the ones that we often think about when we think about why genetics is important. So just to give you some examples, and many of these you already brought up in the chat, autism, some types of autism are caused by changes in our genes, as are some cognitive issues and developmental concerns that we see. Hearing loss and vision can also be related to genetic changes in certain cases. Blood disorders, that's one thing that I didn't see in the chat, but you probably have heard of sickle cell disease or thalassemia. Those are anemias that are genetically inherited. Cancers are caused by changes in our genes, and some of these cancers are hereditary in nature. And of course, we have, as mentioned, cardiac defects can also be caused by changes in our genes. So understanding our genetics can be very helpful. So when we think about EI and genetics, it's important to know, and maybe you're not aware of this, but there are now 1,500 genes that have been identified that are associated with developmental challenges. That's a lot of genes. And just to give you some example, we now know that about 25% of cases of autism have a known genetic cause. And so autism can be autism alone, but autism can be part of a genetic syndrome. So it's always important when we see someone with autism to confirm whether it is genetic in nature. And as you can appreciate, this can also have an impact on recurrence for other children in the family. Hearing loss, 50 to 60% of hearing loss that occurs in babies does have a genetic component. And when a lot of you mentioned vision and retinitis pigmentosa, which is a very common cause of vision loss, 50 to 60% of those cases are also caused by changes in our gene. So I'd like to now turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Alyssa, who's going to talk a little bit more about genetics to make sure that we're all on the same page. Alyssa?
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm curious, you guys just mentioned a lot of great things in the chat in terms of health conditions that come to mind, but what other words, technical words, scientific words come to mind when we talk about genetics? If you could put some examples in the chat, that'd be great to hear kind of what you guys think about. Great. Hereditary gene therapy, epigenetics, syndromes, deletions, mutations. Those are all great examples. Mutations of unknown cause. We will talk about that. Thank you for sharing that one. Heredity. Mosaic. Oh, these are good ones. Perfect. Mitochondria. We're going to talk about mitochondria. Carriers. Great. So on the next slide, we can see some of the words that other people brought up when we asked this question of them. So we see words like DNA, family, atom, genomes, patterns. So these are all words that can become important, and words that families might bring up when you're talking to them about what's going on with their child. So what we hope to do today is really give you some simple ways to think about some of the key words that come up. So on the next slide, to really help us think about some of the most common and useful words you'll hear, we're going to talk through a cooking analogy today that will help you see how DNA, genes, chromosomes, and genomes relate to each other, and how changes in the DNA can result in health challenges. So we're going to come back to this picture again in a few slides, and it's also going to be available to you as a handout. So the first word we talked about, DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, which you do not need to know. And basically DNA is the alphabet that we use to write instructions that tell our body how to grow and function. And it just, instead of using the whole alphabet, our body only uses the letters A, T, C, and G. So I want you to think about these letters as the letters that we're going to use to write out recipes. So on the next slide, have most people heard of the word gene? So people say you have a gene for blonde hair, things like that. Thumbs up if people have heard that before. Perfect. Good. So genes are really just sections of the DNA that contain instructions or recipes to make things that the body needs, like our proteins, enzymes, or other products in the cells. You can see at the bottom here that we really think of a gene like a single recipe for something. For most, but not all of our genes, we have two copies. So one from our mom and one from our dad. And just like you might get passed down a cookie recipe, both from your mom's side of the family and your dad's side of the family, those recipes might be identical, they might be really similar, or perhaps they could be pretty different. So we're going to think through that as well. And on the next slide, we talk about the word chromosome. So a chromosome is like a recipe book. So it's a collection of DNA, and each chromosome has many genes in it, just like a recipe book has many recipes. So in human cells, like our skin cells, hair cells, heart cells, we usually have 46 chromosomes, and they come in 23 pairs, as I said, one from your mom and one from your dad for each copy. The chromosomes are numbered, number 1 to number 22, and then that 23rd pair are what we call sex chromosomes, and we label them X and Y. So one really common genetic condition that most of you have probably heard of is Down syndrome, which is when there are 3 copies of chromosome number 21 in the cell instead of 2 copies. There are many other ways that a person can have chromosome differences. There can be extra or missing chromosomes, pieces of the chromosome missing or duplicated or rearranged. So if you think again about that set of recipe books, it would be looking to see if anyone was missing or had an extra copy of one of their 46 or 47 books, or if the books are missing sections or have extra sections in them. And I also want to note quickly here, which someone brought up in the chat when I asked about the words, that there is some DNA in our cells that's not part of these 46 chromosomes, and instead it's in our mitochondria. So that mitochondrial DNA we get all from our mother. And that's not, you don't need to know a lot of detail about that, except that there's just kind of this one little part of our DNA that doesn't fit into the what we typically hear about our 46 chromosomes. So then on the next slide, a lot of us have probably heard people talk about the human genome or about genome sequencing. So when we think about the genome, it's really just the whole set of genetic instructions. So it's all the information that's contained in that full set of 46 recipe books, plus that mitochondrial DNA from our mother. So it's just your full set is our genome. So on the next slide, we're going to come back now to that picture that I showed you in the beginning. So to bring this all together, we're using that A, T, C, and G of the DNA alphabet to write out our recipes. One gene is like a single recipe. One chromosome is like a book that contains a bunch of recipes. And the genome is a full set of recipe books where there are 23 books, and you got one of each from your mom, one of each from your dad, and plus that one extra bit of DNA in our mitochondria from our mom. And the whole point of these recipes is to tell our body how to make something that we need, which is usually a protein. And the goal of that recipe, just like you might have a recipe for a cake. So on the next slide, we're going to think a little bit about how changes in our genes can sometimes lead to health challenges or disability. Before we get into that, we think it's really important to remind people that genes themselves do not cause disease. So genetic conditions are caused by changes that alter a gene's function. So for people say that someone has the cystic fibrosis gene, they are usually talking about a version of that gene that contains a variant in the DNA sequence or the recipe that makes the protein come out differently. And that protein can't perform its typical body function, and therefore the person has health challenges. But all people, including those without cystic fibrosis, do have a cystic fibrosis gene. So that's just a little clarification that sometimes can be helpful. And on the next slide, we also want to remind people that not all genetic changes cause health challenges. Sometimes they have no impact. Sometimes they can have just a minor change in the way a person looks, and sometimes they can actually be advantageous. But there are some changes that alter the form or function of a product that the body really needs. And these changes are referred to with different terms. So somebody had put in the chat earlier the word mutation. And you will hear that word sometimes, but more commonly now you'll hear people talk about genetic variants. So these genetic variants can create no change, they can create good change, and they can create small or large health challenges for our bodies. So on the next slide, we come back to our recipe and cake idea. So we think about that. I'm curious if you can just give me a thumbs up. How many of you have ever copied a recipe to give to somebody else? So either you're copying it by hand or you're typing it out so that you can give it to somebody that wanted a recipe from you, or maybe your mom gave you a recipe. Perfect. So a lot of us have had that experience. Sometimes when we make copies of things, we might make a little typo, right? Like we might change a letter or something might happen when we're making that copy. So that same thing happens when we copy our DNA. So if we change something in the DNA in the recipe, it can change what we get as our final product. So here's an example. You can see that the recipe changed and called for cheese instead of cocoa. So the outcome is cheesecake instead of chocolate cake. And we think those are both great outcomes. I'm curious if anyone can think of a genetic change that they know of that causes people to have minor differences like this, which are both equally great, like chocolate cake or cheesecake. Can anyone think of a genetic difference like that you've seen before, maybe in your own family or in friends? Perfect. Eye color. Yes, that's usually the first one that comes to mind, and that's a perfect example. So people have genetic differences that cause us to have different colored eyes. But that's not a health challenge, right? That's not a health problem. That's just a difference, just like chocolate cake and cheesecake are. Wonderful, thank you. So on the next slide, so when we have a genetic change happening in the body, sometimes, again, that protein that our body really needs might not be produced in a high enough amount, or it may take a different shape or format. And sometimes these differences in quantity or function can begin to appear as visible changes or symptoms to an outside observer like you. So I'm curious if you can tell me either in the chat or using your stamper, which I know some people have experience in using in Zoom, which parts of the body do you think that genetic changes can impact? So you can either type things in the chat or tell us with your stamper where on the boy you think things impact him. Great. We have lots of examples, and I like the person that said literally everything, and then another one that says everything. But yes, these are all skin, facial features, whole body. Okay, so Erica, if we click again, oh, and I love people are using the stamper. Perfect. With the big circle. Okay. Okay. So Radhika, if you click again, your instincts were correct. It really can affect every part of the body when we think about where genetic changes can have an impact. So you're all right. So on the next slide, I'm curious how many people on this call have something that they believe runs in their family. And if anyone wanted to share an example in the chat of something that they think runs in their family, and it could be, non-medical issues too. Loose joints, yeah, we see that a lot. High cholesterol, diabetes, migraines, hearing loss. So I find that most families have something that they believe is running in the family. Learning disabilities, rolling your tongue, things like that. So we think it's useful for people to know that there are a lot of different ways that we can see genetic changes pass through families. We have one example here in the picture that we call autosomal dominant. The word autosomal just means that it's on one of our numbered chromosomes, those recipe books number 1 to 22. So in this example, you can see that the father has one gene or recipe that's different from what we typically see. It's gray, and that has caused some health challenges for him. His partner does not have that changed gene. She has 2 copies of the typical purple recipe. So when they have children, they each have to pass down one of their copies of each gene. So sometimes the dad will pass on his copy of the gray recipe that is changed, and the child will have health challenges. But sometimes the dad will pass on the purple copy of the recipe that is typical, and the child will not have that health challenge. But this is not the only way that gene changes are passed through families or found in people with health challenges. Have you heard of people talking about being carriers? And I actually did see that come up when we asked earlier about words that you think of. So the word carrier came up. So in autosomal recessive inheritance, a person has to have changes in both copies of their recipe in order to have the health condition. So that means the mom and the dad both pass on a changed copy of the recipe to their child. And when a person carries just one change, they are often healthy without symptoms of the condition, although there are some exceptions where carriers do have some symptoms. And I can see people in the chat, commenting that they have experience with that. We also see X-linked conditions, and those are genetic changes on the X chromosome. And another way that genetic conditions show up is by changes in the DNA outside of those 22 numbered chromosomes I talked about in the DNA we have in the mitochondria that come from our mother. So changes in the mitochondrial DNA are only inherited from the mother. We also really want to point out that new genetic changes happen all the time. So when our body copies our recipe books to hand them down to our children, it often results in little differences in the copying, which results in new DNA changes in the children that are not seen in the parents. So imagine if you were sitting down to copy 20,000 recipes to pass them on to your kids. It wouldn't be surprising at all if there were a few typing differences, which would mean that the recipes your kids have now have little changes compared to the recipes that you were using. When we see these new genetic changes in children that we didn't see in their parents, we call these new changes de novo. It's really important to know that not all genetic conditions are inherited in the sense that the parent has the same change as the child have. Sometimes they're just brand new in the child. And then lastly, sometimes you'll hear about somatic changes in the DNA. And that just means that the DNA in our cells can be changed over time as it copies itself over and over to make new cells. But when those changes happen in the cells of our body that won't be passed down to our kids, they won't cause inherited genetic conditions. In order to pass things down to your children, you have to have that genetic change in your sperm cells or egg cells. So we definitely do not expect any of you to commit all of this to memory. We just think it's important to know that there's a lot of different ways that genetic changes can be passed down through a family or appear in a family for the very first time. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Radhika.
Thank you, Alyssa. That was an incredibly thorough explanation of genetics, and I couldn't have said it better. So thank you, Alyssa, for doing that. So now that we've talked about genetics and how genetics can impact the family, why might a family want a genetics appointment, especially if they're not aware of a condition running? So can you, using your chat, maybe suggest some reasons why a family might seek out a referral to genetics? I see some already popping in. Yes, Casey, unknown origin of delays. Yes, that's a big one. To get a diagnosis, the first child with autism, answers as to what's going on, information for support, whether it's medical or educational, family planning. Wow, to figure out the why, to see if siblings show similar changes. Yes, excellent. Gina, again, family planning. Beth, to prepare. Yes. Melissa, yes, people who know that they're carriers of diseases or conditions. Narana, to know how to support them. Yes, because Judy, they may get a referral from their pediatrician. And I see that, yeah, an extended family member could say that, your child reminds me of. And yes, to find out how it may affect your children. These are all really great. Really, you guys are on top of this. And these are many of those reasons that we talk about. So I'm just going to, a lot of these you've mentioned already, but I'm just going to reiterate it now, that we find that families oftentimes are interested in an appointment with genetics because, as many of you mentioned, they may notice a symptom in their child, something that is just really concerning them. Maybe, like we said, this could be a child that's not reaching their milestones at the same speed as, other children, cousins, nieces, nephews, their peers. And that just concerns the parent. It could be to follow up on a symptom that the parent may not notice, but the primary care says, their height is not where it should be on this scale, and I'm really concerned. Or another concern that the primary care may notice. It could also be that there are more than one issues happening in the child, and either the family or the pediatrician says, I wonder if there's something that's causing both of these, one unique thing that may be causing these two conditions, say a heart defect as well as hearing problems, and say, I wonder, they might be connected. I've heard of a genetic condition that can cause both. It could also be because they noticed that, as some people in the chat mentioned, that there were symptoms that were happening in other family members that were similar that maybe they also see in their child, and they want to know, is this running in our family? Is there something going on? It could also be because they notice a child that was developing starts to regress, and they can't pinpoint what changed that made them suddenly lose milestones. Maybe a child that was walking is no longer able to walk and relying on crawling and then having trouble with crawling. Um, as another person mentioned, support. Support is huge. Families who feel like they're going through these journeys alone, struggling with a child that has some differences, want to see, is there someone else that's going through this same journey with me that may be able to help me? Um, it could be because the families know that there is something running in their family. I brought up before sickle cell. So maybe they know that, hey, my sister has sickle cell disease. I wonder if I'm a carrier too. Would that mean my child could have it? So there could be something like that. And it could also be that they recognize that their child has some sort of condition, which they know has a genetic component, and they want to know, is this something that there's treatment available to them? So these are all many of the reasons that families seek a referral for genetics, as well as the ones you all kindly brought up in the chat. But there are also there are some concerns families have and some misunderstandings that may prevent them from going to a genetics appointment. So Seth is right now going to pop up a quick poll, and with 6 statements, and I would like you to please take a moment to select which of those statements are correct. So Seth, I will leave that to you. So hopefully you guys can see a poll up right now.
We can, Radhika, and they're replying.
Okay, great.
We're doing
I'm
fine.
not seeing it on my end, so
Yeah.
I will trust that you can see it.
I'll be kind of watching, give you or Seth will a heads up, but lots of people are responding right now.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So yeah, there are 6 different statements here. So please only select the ones that you believe are true. And again, if you happen to think none of them are true, don't select any then. That's fine as well. Okay, we're going to give it about maybe 10 more seconds. Yes, Andrea, I think you can submit without selecting any. I think that should be fine. Seth, I
Those of
think
you
there's,
who are replying in chat, we're able to see those too, so that's
yeah,
just
so if you
fine.
want to
Mhm.
reply in chat, that's fine too. I see a lot of people have said none. So, Seth, are you able to show the results?
Yes.
Okay.
And apologies if you tried to not select any. I thought maybe the poll question would allow you not to.
Radhika, are you able to see the poll results, or would you like me to share the results with
Could
you?
you share it? Yeah, I'm not seeing it.
Absolutely.
Thank
So
you
it
so much
looks
for it.
like, Radhika, the first one, all genetic conditions are detected at birth through newborn 14% thought that was true.
Okay.
The second one, every childhood condition is caused by genetics. 25% thought that was true.
Mm-hmm.
All genetic conditions are untreatable. 3%. A genetic diagnosis cannot help a child thrive. 8%.
Okay.
All genetic changes cause disease. 3%. Here's your whopper. 56% thought all genetic testing is very expensive.
Thank you, Corey, very much for sharing those results.
Of course.
So I will move on to the next slide, and you will see that, in fact, they are all false. So those who in the chat said, wait a minute, what if none of them are true? You are right. They are all false statements. And I'll quickly go through why they're all false. So the first one about newborn screening, all genetic conditions are detected at newborn screening at birth. Not true at all. In fact, newborn screening only looks for a limited number of genetic conditions, and the conditions that are on the panel are those that require immediate treatment to prevent serious complications or even death. The number of conditions that are tested vary state to state and average around 30. But as you may be aware, there are thousands of genetic conditions that are in existence and that are recognized. So the majority of genetic conditions are not detected at birth. So that's false. Statement number 2, every childhood condition is caused by genetics. I believe you all, as early interventionists, I can understand why these days we seem to think genetics is the cause for everything, but unfortunately that's not true, or fortunately, however you look at it. There are some childhood conditions that are caused by environmental factors that we call, such as birth trauma or an exposure to chemicals, or just random pressures that may happen during the growth of the baby. Maybe there's restriction because of low amniotic fluids. So some of the conditions that we see in a child are not genetic in nature, but we call them sporadic. They just happen on their own, or as we mentioned, it could be because of an environmental factor. So not everything can be linked back to genetics. All genetic conditions are untreatable or uncurable. Thankfully, that is not the case. Most genetic conditions have some sort of treatment. Only some are curable, but a lot of them do have treatment, which can include interventions through therapy, such as early intervention, physical therapy, speech therapy, and certain medications can help to the quality of lives of people with genetic conditions. So that leads into the next statement: a genetic diagnosis cannot help a child thrive. I am so happy to say that's false. In fact, a genetic diagnosis can help a family by taking them out of this odyssey and helping them recognize what's happening in their child. It can help lead them to appropriate specialists who can provide them with proper management and care. And oftentimes it can help alleviate guilt from a parent who's thinking, did I do something wrong? did I do something that caused my child to have this? As we all know, we have no control over our genetics. As Alyssa was just saying, it's a randomness of what genes are passed down, right? And there's can be random changes that happen during the copying of our genes. So, by understanding if there's a genetic change, it really can help a child thrive because we can know what's going on. We can maybe predict a little more about a prognosis for the child, and we can help the family by providing them with support, by connecting them with other families who are going through the same thing. Again, hopefully you all realize, and I see only 3% thought this was true, but you all for the most part recognize that all genetic changes do not cause disease. As Alyssa alluded to, that some genetic changes and differences just cause variability that we see. For instance, we mentioned eye color. It can also be a person's height. You see people in the family that are all different heights. You see difference in hair color, eye color. So genetic variability is what makes us different from one person to another, and it does not always cause disease or maleffects. And finally, the one that Corey, you brought up, that 56% of you still think that all genetic testing is very expensive. Now, of course, everyone has a different definition to what expensive means, but I can say that the prices of genetic testing has dropped significantly over the last decade, and thanks in part to better technology and a lot of competition between a lot of labs creating different tests. So genetic testing is no longer in the hundreds of thousands of dollars or even thousands of dollars. Oftentimes genetic testing can be a couple $100, which I understand may still be challenging for some families to afford. But the great thing is genetic testing can and oftentimes is covered by insurance and federal assistance programs. So genetic testing has become much more accessible today. So now that we've talked about why families might go to genetic referrals, what does early intervention have to do with this? Why are we talking to you all about genetics? Well, simply because, as we've been alluding to, there are a lot of overlaps between concerns that would trigger a referral to early intervention services and concerns that would trigger a referral to genetics. Many of those concerns that a family might notice or a primary care or pediatrician would notice happen to occur during the first few years of life, when an early intervention professional may already be involved in a family's home and be working with the child. And because you all know early interventionists get to see a child frequently, they may be seeing the child more frequently than any other medical provider, and they may be uniquely positioned because of that advantage of noticing a child's progression or regression, or just seeing them on a regular basis to notice if something is concerning. And therefore, they've also built that trust with the family because they've been in their home and have been working with them, and hopefully the family is seeing progress, that the early intervention professional are in a unique position to help the family advocate if a genetic referral is something that they wish to pursue. So Alyssa mentioned in her earlier slides that when a genetic change happens inside the body, it can impact how a protein is made. And the protein can either, maybe the quantity is affected so that there's not enough protein made, or maybe too much protein is made, or the protein could be made differently than what's usually created, right? So this changes in a protein can sometimes cause changes that can be visible to an outside observer, and those changes are called red flags. And those red flags may be something that an early intervention professional may notice because of their proximity and their frequency in seeing the child. So red flags simply are signs and symptoms that are seen in a child's medical history or in an examination that could give a clue that the person has a medical condition. And in this case, we're thinking about a genetic condition. For example, someone may wake up with a rash or may develop a rash. Now, that could just be because they rubbed up against something, or it could be because they ingested something that they're allergic to. So by looking for these red flags, it helps to better determine whether someone could benefit from seeing genetics. So again, because you all are trained to look for milestones that occur during the ages of 0 to 3, which is the same time a lot of these genetic conditions can start showing these red flags, you are uniquely positioned to help families notice these changes and bring them to the attention of their pediatrician, and hopefully trigger a referral to genetics. So my guess is that in your experiences, many of you have already had experiences with genetic conditions. So using the chat, perhaps you can help us by sharing some of the genetic conditions that the children you've worked with have had. So yeah, Prader-Willi, yes, that's one of my favorite. We're going to be talking about that just now. Trisomy 21, also referred to as Down syndrome. Oh, duplication 15q. Cornelia de Lange, trisomy 9, NF, Noonan's, Angelman syndrome, SCN 8A, Turner's, oh my God, craniofacial, oh my, Jacobs, George, yes, Brett's, Weiderman Steiner, I'm not even familiar with that one, but you guys, wow, Down syndrome, Prader-Willi, Angelman, MPS's, FMA, you guys have really seen a lot. Sickle cell, as we brought up, Hurler's, Cri-du-chat. Wow, that's a very rare one. Nor's, 3P deletion. Oh, trisomy 13, Melissa, that's another one. Joubert, Apert syndrome. Yes, that's a great one. 9Q. Yes, so you all have had a lot of experience already working with people with genetic conditions. So let's take this one step further. Has anyone on the call today ever suspected that there's a health condition in a family that you're working with that might be genetic in nature, but there's just no diagnosis yet? Oh, Kelly is emphatic. Yes, yes. Darcy agrees. Janine. Oh, wow. Lauren, you suspect mosaic trisomy 21. Okay, Tara's emphatic in saying yes, she has. So wow. So a lot of you do see that that there are cases where genetics may be helpful for the families, but there's just that connection has not been made yet. And hopefully through working with us today and working with the genetic navigators, which we're going to talk about in part 2, we can help to build those connections and help families access genetic services. So as I've alluded to, there's a lot of overlap between developmental red flags and genetics red flags. So some of you brought up Prader-Willi. So hypotonia is oftentimes a reason why a family might get referred for early intervention services. And hypotonia, for anyone who's not familiar, is decreased muscle tone, sometimes referred to as a floppy baby. So that can be a sign of developmental delay, but hypotonia is oftentimes a red flag for other conditions that are genetic, such as autism, or a condition such as some of you who are familiar with Prader-Willi. In fact, I've read that up to 30% of children or babies in the NICU who have hypotonia may have a Prader-Willi diagnosis. So there you go. That's just one example. So what we thought would be interesting today is together to talk about a little more in depth about what some of those red flags. So here is just a very general slide, and you will have access to this in your handouts about what are some of the red flags that may trigger a referral to genetics by the child's pediatrician. So these include issues with speech, learning, development, movement, the child's growth, physical features, the way they digest food or feed, behaviors, vision issues, hearing issues, heart defects, or complicated medical issues. So these are all reasons why children may be referred to genetics. But families can also be referred to genetics if they've been told previously that they have a higher chance to have a child with a health issue, if they already have a family member with a genetic condition, or if they believe, their family's medical issues could have a genetic explanation. So these are all reasons why genetics may be useful for families. But let's dive into these a little deeper and let's talk about what are some red flags that you think may trigger a referral for genetics when it comes to movement. Can you use the chat to just give me a few examples? And I know we have 10 minutes left, so we're going to go through these a little quickly, but can you think of some red flags in this relating to movement that might trigger? So I'll give you a hint. We just talked about hypotonia. That's when you have floppy or muscle tone. Yes, yep. Hypertonia. Yep, that's another one here. Stiff muscle tone. Yes, weakness. That's right here. Ataxic is right. Right. That's a great one. Lack of coordination, tremor. Yep. And we also have the big one, walking late. Yep. So motor delay, right? Not holding their head up, rolling over, crawling, or walking. All of these are examples of why of movement issues that may be related to a genetic condition. And I see some really great ones also that are mentioned in the chat that aren't on here, like tremors and spasticity and regression and using muscles for tasks that are different than what is usual, like breathing. Great ones. So let's move on to speech. Can you give me some examples of some speech issues which you think may be potentially genetic in nature that might trigger a genetic referral? Yes, nonverbal. Nonverbal is a big one. Apraxia. Yes, cleft palate. Yes, that's delayed language. So I will give you some other ones just because we're all out of time. You guys are bringing up some interesting ones, but regression is definitely there. So we have, not responding to name, articulation, lip and tongue tie. So we have echolalia is one. And we also have here, not babbling. But yes, you bring up some other ones that aren't here, like cleft palate, lip and tongue tie, feeding delays. So these are some speech issues that could be genetic in nature. Can we think about some behavioral issues that may be along the lines? And I'm just going to start showing you some because we are limited in time. But a big one here is autism. And we talked about repetitive play and styming. We also talk about not interested in play, right? Yes, sensory sensitivity is another one. So I'm just going to show you these since we are limited here, but constantly crying, low frustration tolerance, that could be one. Lack of eye contact, which is also mentioned in the chat. Sensory sensitivity, not interested in social play, emotional social issues, ADHD, right? These are all concerns, as well as many of the other ones you brought up in the chat. We also talked, and again, some of you, when we talked about digestion, you brought about these, and please continue using the chat to bring up some other ones, but we talked about difficulty swallowing, constipation, could that be it? So that's definitely one. Gagging and choking is definitely here. We have gagging, we have persistent vomiting. You guys, really, I wish we had more time to do all this, but poor appetite can be one. Gastroparesis, yes, we have latching issues, breastfeeding issues, feeding tube, slow emptying, and constantly hungry, right? So those are ones, with Prader-Willi, that's one of the ones there. And then we think about growth. Growth is another reason that a red flag that can happen that can cause people to be referred to genetics. So really quickly, we can have slow or uneven growth, which you guys have brought up, slow weight gain, failure to thrive, which I'm sure you know, growing too fast, too tall. Yep, I see too much, too little. We have growing pain and limb and trunk. Yes, fatigues actively. So these are that. And then many of these have already been brought up before, so I'm just going to click on them quickly. Physical features such as clefting, large head size, small head size, stature, facial features, frequently dislocated joints, spinal and skeletal differences are all reasons for genetics, as well as you can imagine, these complicated ones. When you have a regression, immune issues, children with multiple syndromes, symptoms with no cause, pulmonary cardiac concerns, neurological concerns, and pediatric cancers. And so there's a lot that can be going on. And Alyssa will take us to the end because we're almost there. So Alyssa, please, let's take us home.
All right. So we know those last 7 slides had just an absolute ton of information on them. Again, we don't expect you to remember all of those, and there's going to be a great handout available for you that kind of summarizes all. And this will also appear on there. So one way to think about looking for these clues to a genetic condition is called the rule of 2s. And I saw somebody in the chat kind of use this already. So you want to be thinking about, are people taller than you would expect or shorter? Are people getting sick younger than you'd expect with things like cancer? Are there just too many people in the family with similar health issues? Is this person's health challenges too different than what you'd expect? Is there a person or family that just has too many different illnesses going on? And then also think about the number 2. So do you see a person with 2 tumors in different parts of the body, similar health issues over 2 generations, like a parent and a child, 2 people in the family with the same health challenges, like siblings, or maybe a child with 2 birth defects? So that really, this is just a broader way to think about looking for those possible clues. And again, this is on the handout as well. And also on the next slide, we want to remind people that when we think about these red flags, I'm sure that as we talk through them, a lot of the red flags on those lists are people that are things that we see in healthy people all the time. So we know a lot, and perhaps even most kids will have at least one red flag at some point in their life. And while we do typically see that every child with a genetic diagnosis has a red flag of some kind at some point, maybe they're hard to find, maybe parents and providers miss them, maybe they're really subtle, like things like fatigue, but usually there's a red flag of some kind in every child with a genetic condition. However, every child with a red flag does not have a genetic condition. So a red flag is really just a clue that there could be something going on. There are many, many people who have features and symptoms that are on a red flag list that do not have a medical condition related to their red flags. It's just that the more red flags you see, the more a doctor may want to look into medical or genetic causes. So on the next slide, we're just going to sort of start to talk about what to do if you see a red flag or several and start to get concerned. So in Virginia, in order to promote a medical home model of care, we do encourage that all families start with a conversation with their primary care provider. And from there, a detailed family history can be taken and a decision made to start a workup immediately or refer to genetics. So we're going to be encouraging you to talk to families about sharing their concerns with their pediatrician or primary care provider and have a conversation about exploring potential genetic causes of those symptoms. And we'll talk more about how you can start those conversations when we meet again in part 2 of this series together. There may be some unique situations where families reach out to genetics directly, but that's really pretty rare. So on the next slide, we just want to say thank you. I know we have almost no time. So on the next slide, we have, again, a link to that survey that you took in the beginning. And we offer the survey again so that we can really see if things change over the course of our conversation. So hopefully Seth can drop the link again in the chat, and you can either use the QR code that you see up there or use the link to complete the survey for the second time.
Radhika and Alyssa, I just want to thank you. This was such great information. We are going to be dropping the link to the handout. And so please feel free to share that. We also have purposely put out a little bit of tidbit, come back in part 2 in October, because we're going to talk about what this can look like in Virginia with the Virginia Genetic Navigators program. So we really encourage you to come back. Our next Talks on Tuesday is October 5th from 12 to 1. As a reminder, if you were registered for today's session, you are automatically registered for October. Seth has dropped the resource handout. Please feel free to stay on and complete the webinar survey. It might give us a little bit of information that if we want to tweak something to try to address something in October, we will do that. And for those of you who had questions about insurance in Virginia, we will try to see if we can answer. Kelly and Tara, I remember you had questions. So again, I want to thank Radhika and Alyssa for such great information. We hope you will join us on October 5th. Alyssa and Radhika's handouts also have lots of good resources that we're sharing with you. And you will get a survey in your inbox as soon as we're finished. Just like always, take the survey and you will get the certificate. I'm seeing Susan, the certificate states 8.5. We can get that changed if you have any problem with that. So again, thank you all for joining us. It is 1 o'clock. I know y'all are busy folks, so have a good day. And we will see you in October. Thanks, everybody.